Can you see God in science?
Science is a study, a set of disciplines that are geared to evaluating essentially what nature is, how it works, and so on and so forth. Now, if there is a God who created it, and God is a rational God, we would expect to see traces, evidence of his activity in what he made, just like most artifacts bear some evidence that they are artifacts, that there is an artificer. And I would say yes, but I wouldn't rush and say, I see God, evidence of God in this detail or that detail of science. I would step back and say what I think is a far bigger thing, that one of the main evidences that point towards God is what lay behind the rise of science. That is, all science depends on a fundamental faith that the universe is rationally intelligible. Now, if we're thinking in that context, we have basically two worldviews that are sitting behind all this, coming up from the ancient Greeks. One worldview says the universe is self-explanatory. There's nothing but matter and energy. Everything must be exhaustively explicable bottom-up without remainder. The other worldview is that this universe isn't all there is and doesn't explain itself. The Christian version of that is there is a God who created it and upholds it. Now, looking at nature, looking at the fact we can do science, simply the fact we can do science, very strongly points me towards the Christian view. Why? Because if there is no God, then my mind is essentially my brain. There's nothing immaterial in the universe. So my mind is my brain. What is my brain? Well, it's been produced by unguided processes. Okay? Now, one of the very interesting things that means, and Richard Dawkins virtually admits it in his book, that if the human brain has been cobbled together like this, we might not expect it to be terribly reliable. Well, that's the understatement of the century. How does rationality come out of irrationality? In other words, what I'm suggesting is what was suggested by a chemist, Haldane, years ago. You know, if I believe that the thoughts in my mind are simply the random motions of atoms in my brain, why should I believe those thoughts? In particular, why should I believe my brain's composed of atoms? You know, you're cutting off the branch in which you're sitting. So that the thing that disturbs me about the atheist worldview is not that it's anti-God, it is that by definition, but it's anti-rationality. It cuts the grounds from science. It gives me no rational justification for believing in the rational intelligibility of nature, whereas Christian theism tells me that I can, in part at least, understand the universe out there with my mind in here, because both ultimately, by whatever processes, ultimately go back to the rationality of God.
John, how would you respond to those who would say science deals with facts, the real world, religion deals with fantasy, or to put it more kindly, things that can't be tested?
You sound a bit like Stephen Jay Gould, you know, when you say that, with his wonderful notion of noma, non-overlapping magisteria. Science and religion can coexist so long as you keep them separate.
Which, of course, Dawkins hates.
Yes, but now you read the subtext of Jay Gould and you see that science deals with reality and religion with everything else. Well, that won't do for me. I think this is a totally distorted view of both science on the one hand and some religion on the other hand. We've got to realize that sometimes religious people have given precisely that impression because they believe it, that they have no facts. But as a Christian, I want to say that Christianity is based solidly on factual evidence. After all, we're claiming that God is not only given evidence of his existence in creation, in nature, but we're saying much more. We're saying God has actually come into human history. So now we're in your field. That is the field of ancient history. And for me, the heart of Christianity is evidence-based. Jesus makes a claim to be the Son of God, to be God incarnate. Well, that is such a stupendous thing that either it's crazy and we forget about it, it's lunatic fringe, tooth fairy and all the rest of it, or Well, or what? Is there any evidence for it? And the New Testament claims that the evidence for it is the fact that as a matter of history, Jesus rose from the dead. And therefore, I feel we can apply the methodology of ancient historians to investigate that just as much. And I think this is very important. See, when we use the word science, often people are thinking of the kind of science they learned in school, repeated experimentation. But they don't realize that a lot of science, particularly in the fields we're talking about, is what could far better be described as historical science. You're dealing with events that by definition cannot be repeated. We can't repeat the creation of the universe. We can't repeat the history of the universe, just as we can't repeat the Battle of Waterloo. But we can get a handle on them by making inferences to the best explanation using the available evidence. And for me, both in science and in Christianity, the same criteria hold, in the sense that we need evidence. I would be a fool to believe in God if there wasn't any evidence, you see. So I feel we can get a handle on it that way. But there's one caveat here, and the caveat is this. With science, we tend to be looking all the time from a distance. We're skeptics, because that's what the word means. It means to check from a distance. Now, that's very important in Christianity as well. We look at the evidence and so on. But if you want to get to know a person, and the claim is that God is a person, not just a theory, you will never get to know a person if you keep a distance. You've got to be prepared to open yourself to that person. So, to my mind, the evidence now shifts from the objective historical side, scientific side if you like, to the subjective side, and both belong together. And you can ask yourself the question, well, if Jesus really is the Son of God, and he claims that if you respond to him and trust him, you can receive forgiveness, you can have peace with God, well, does that work in life? How does it affect family life? How does it affect everything else? And I think that's a very important part of the evidence, but it's real evidence, and if you like, it's hard facts.